Hi there, welcome to Real Relationship Talk. I'm Dana Shea, and today you are in for a treat. I am so excited to present to you all my friend, Dr. Jessica McLeese. Jessica and I have been friends for a couple of years, and when we met, we just hit it right off. We have so many things in common, one of them being that we have a passion for marriages and families and healthy relationships. So in today's talk, Jessica and I talk about all things that are related to sex because she is a sex therapist. And so you guys know I am all about this conversation, okay? So today we talk about things like sexual brokenness and how that shows up in relationships. And we also talk about intimacy and what intimacy really is, because there's a lot of definitions out there flying around about what intimacy is, and we're just going to debunk some of those myths today. So you are not going to want to miss this talk today. Go ahead and get a notepad out because you're going to learn so much. She's going to give you some resources that you might want to check into. Let's go ahead and get into my talk today with Dr. Jessica McLeese. Well, today I am really excited to have my friend Jessica here on the show on Real Relationship Talk. So Jessica, why don't you tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, first of all.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a certified sex therapist, and everything I do is from a Christian background. So what I do is I help couples and sometimes individuals really work on their relationship. Sometimes that includes their intimate relationship. Not always, but marriage and intimacy are so intimately connected that we typically work on both when we're working together.
That's so good. So how did you get involved in this work? I mean, I can't imagine that like as an elementary school student, you're like, when I grow up, I want to be a sex therapist. Like, how did that work out?
That's true. Actually, that did come much later.
Yeah.
Originally, I really planned on being a youth minister, so that's actually kind of funny. Yeah, so I was going to be a youth minister. I went and took youth pastoring classes so that I could be trained and ready to do that. Mm-hmm. And during those classes, I was forced to take some counseling classes. So that was just part of the program. You had to do that. So I took some counseling classes, and then while I was taking those, I just realized that it came naturally to me, and it all just made sense. And so I decided to transition out of youth ministry into counseling instead. Mm. And then it wasn't long into the counseling program that I started realizing that I was really interested in sexual brokenness and sexual healing, and really part of that comes from my own background. Mm. So I write about it often on my blog, or at least I have written about it in the past, but I come from my own sexual trauma and brokenness. Mm-hmm. And so coming into the work that I'm doing now is partially really because I've walked through that healing, and so I feel like God has put me in a place where I can also help others walk through that healing.
Yeah, and I just love that about God. I love the fact that, He'll take our own brokenness and say, not only am I going to restore and heal you, but then I'm going to use that same redemption to help so many other people. And I know that you've been a blessing to so many couples.
Oh, thank you.
So it starts to make me think, I don't think if you were to go and poll the average American married couple and ask them, are you sexually broken? They would say yes. Right. So how do people know if they are experiencing any areas of sexual brokenness?
Yeah. Well, I would say ask yourself this question: am I breathing?
Okay. Yes.
And then the next question is, am I having sex?
Yes.
So probably there's a level of sexual brokenness. Now, certainly, I don't want you guys to think, well, sexual brokenness means everything about me is somehow hurting or damaged. Mm. That's really not the case. But there's no such thing as perfection anymore on this earth because we've all been impacted by sin. Mm-hmm. So we all have pieces of brokenness in us. Now, your brokenness may be kind of feeling a little bit small, so maybe you and your spouse argue some about sex. Not often, but every once in a while have some intimacy issues and it causes some friction between you. Or it could be similar to my story when I first got married, that there was so much sexual brokenness from my own trauma that I would blame my husband for things that just weren't true. Mm. I would be hurt by him for absolutely no reason. And it had nothing to do with anything other than my own brokenness and feeling like I was being used or somehow unloved when that was never the case. So it's along a spectrum, right? Everything that we go through is along a spectrum where some people will feel more of that brokenness and some of us feel less of it. Really, a recommendation I have that's fantastic is Paul David Tripp's book, Sex in a Broken World. And as you read that, you'll see that all of us have a little bit of that brokenness, and it's our Christian duty to try to improve that part of our life and become more Christ-like, even in our sexuality, or maybe even specifically and purposefully in our sexuality.
Gotcha. So when you're talking about the spectrum, I'm thinking about a married couple who, I did a video on sexless marriage. So if you look at the spectrum, and there's a couple who they're not having sex at all versus a couple that's all they seem to do. I mean, would you say that both ends are representative of some level of brokenness and everything in between?
Absolutely. And that's such a great example, because if sex is the only thing that you do well in your marriage, or the only thing you want to do in your marriage, that certainly is a level of brokenness. But it would be the same if you say, you know what, we're really good friends, we pay bills together, we parent well, we just don't really want to have sex with each other. That's also a level of brokenness. And you can't say which one is worse. You can't say where the one who's almost on a sex addictive level is worse than the one who is more, they used to use the term sexual anorexic, so not wanting anything to do with sex. But you can't say either one of those are worse, because the truth is that's not how God designed us to operate in marriage. So both of them are broken. And I think really that's the key to remember, is that brokenness just means that it's not quite perfection, and perfection doesn't happen this side of earth, but we can work on it and get more and more perfect in our relationships so that we can bond better with one another.
Yeah. Years ago, I took a class. I worked in the nursery, believe it or not. I worked in the nursery years ago. And we had to take this class, and the class was all about sexual trauma and how to identify that. And then, of course, how to protect ourselves from putting ourselves in a position where that could occur, or that it could even be insinuated. And so the statistic, at least back then, was that 1 in 4 females, and then I think it was 1 in 6 males experience sexual trauma as children. So, and I don't know if those statistics have changed in recent years.
It's gone up a little bit for women. It's still, different research says different things, but the 1 in 6 has been the number they've used for men for a long time. But we're pretty sure that that's not accurate, that it's probably far more than that, because there's such a heavy stigma that men aren't as likely to report those things.
That's
or
a good point.
take a 13-year-old boy who has a babysitter at the house that's 25, and she performs sexual acts on him, or gets him to perform them on her. A lot of times that's touted as some kind of growing into manhood or masculinity, when the truth is that's actual sexual trauma and sexual abuse. And so sometimes we don't have clear enough understanding and teaching to let men know that those are actual sexual traumas and can absolutely affect the sexual relationship later.
Gotcha. So when you have such a huge population of people who have experienced sex outside of, obviously, the confines of marriage, or just in a broken way, what would you say to maybe a single person who they're not married, so they don't know, okay, our relationship is experiencing sexual brokenness, but maybe they themselves feel defective, or they feel maybe they've even gone through some sort of counseling or healing, but there's still some sexual brokenness that exists. Like, do you counsel single people? And I'm also even processing married people who maybe they're married and they're like, okay, this is healed, but there's still kind of that residual brokenness there. How would you counsel someone to get out of this?
Sure. It's I can't necessarily say there's a one-way approach for every single person. Absolutely, prayer is a big part of that. There's a therapy called EMDR that is actually the therapy to go through if there's any kind of trauma, especially sexual trauma, but any kind of trauma in your background. And so it's scientifically proven to help you get to the place where that story doesn't hurt as much anymore, doesn't impact you as deeply anymore. Relating as a couple, though, can definitely help, because in marriage we get to learn how to be more sexually whole, because you're in that place where you're having sex. And so there's opportunity over and over again to work through that healing and walk through that healing. For the single, I would say that you're not sexually broken just because you're not having sex.
So good.
Because sexual wholeness is just part of who you are. It's how God has created us. So you are a sexual whole being. You have everything you need to be sexual. It's just you don't have someone in place so that the behavior can be performed. But sexual behavior and sexual just wholeness is not the same thing. Those are actually two separate constructs. We just see the sexual brokenness when we start having sex. So for singles, you can still recognize this though, because even in dating, maybe as things are starting to get a little bit more intimate, so maybe you're holding hands now, or maybe you've had your first kiss, you can still feel those pieces of you sometimes that say what that relationship means. So for some people, if they're not having sex, they think, well, why don't you love me enough? Like, you're not even trying. Even as Christians, they can think that. And others might say, well, all you do is you pursue me, and now I'm scared, and I don't even know if we can be in relationship. All of that hints to sexual brokenness, even if you're not actually having sex.
It's interesting because I think, we all have our stories, and the way that you were raised, I feel like, plays a huge part in it. One of the topics that I was discussing in a video, it may have been the sexless marriage videos, is you have someone who, let's say they were raised in a very religious home, and sex was never talked about, and no one ever sat them down to talk about the good or the bad of sex, and so then they get married, and now they're just expected to perform.
Right.
And I think that can be very traumatic. That's something that I don't really feel like we talk enough about, because we teach people don't have sex before marriage, but then the follow-up teaching is never done. It's like, okay, now you're off to the wolves and go at it,
Yeah, regarding sex, so what we normally tell couples before they get married, right, is don't stop. And then they get married and we're like, don't stop.
Right.
And it's don't stop.
Right.
It's really hard to make that transition. And so what I've found, especially working with couples that are newlyweds, or working with couples maybe that have been married for a couple of years, even up to 5 years or less, they can struggle sometimes in their sexual relationship, and they'll say that, well, we were raised in church and it was a sin, and it was a sin, and it was a sin, and then we got married and we know it's not a sin, but it feels like a sin, and it feels really dirty. And so I definitely think as a church we've got to learn to start teaching people that actually sex is beautiful, and it's a gift from God, and it's something He gives us that not only feels good, but it bonds us to one another. And this is a beautiful piece of the creativity of God, even to create such a wonder as sexuality and then use it to bond us to one another. But it has its rightful place. So there's boundaries within the sexual relationship. It's much like the ocean. So I took a cruise a couple of years ago, and one of the most amazing parts about it that my husband and I loved is we could sit just on these deck chairs basically and look out over at the ocean, and it was like it was never ending, just absolutely expansive. Well, sex is the same way. It's very open, there's freedom, there's a lot of joy and enjoyment to be had, but there's boundaries around it. So even though we couldn't see the land and where that cut off, the ocean only goes so far. It is cut off by land, and so God has created these boundaries, and it's very much the same way in sex. So there's a beauty, there's a freedom. It's massive how much you can do and enjoy together as a couple, and yet there are boundaries around it as well, so that we're protected and we're safe in that relationship.
I love that analogy. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about what are some of the boundaries? If there's a married couple that's watching or listening, they might be thinking, I don't have any boundaries in my sexual relationship. So as a married couple, what are some of the boundaries that you would recommend?
Sure. So what's funny is, because of what I do as a sex therapist, I've sat under talks before in church where they're talking in marriage, saying, the marriage bed is to be kept pure, and it is pure, and so you guys have fun, do whatever you want. And I would say, actually, no, not necessarily, because I've run into people where do whatever you want actually includes behaviors that are incredibly dangerous for the relationship. Behaviors where one spouse maybe feels degraded or unloved or uncared for, or maybe something you're doing triggers a trauma from them in the past, that would be really inappropriate in marriage. All of a sudden you're stepping away from the I love you and I want to be with you into it's about me and I like it, so go along with it. So that's inappropriate. Anything that you have to beg and plead for is probably inappropriate. Now, you did the sexless marriage talk, so certainly if you have someone say, well, no, I don't want to have sex with you, but I want to stay married to you, don't beg and plead. Get help, but begging and pleading isn't going to help with that. So forcing something someone isn't comfortable with would be a problem. Inviting someone else into the marriage is a problem, and this includes pornography, because pornography 100% is bringing someone else in. You're bringing someone else in for your arousal, and you're bringing someone else in so that you can orgasm. That is absolutely bringing someone else into your marriage. So those would be areas that they're not appropriate and they're not okay. So that's part of what we talk about when we say that there are boundaries. I
think as a Christian marriage, because we work with marriages a lot, and I find that even in some Christian marriages, people are inviting pornography into their marriages, and it's like, well, what's wrong with it? I'm not having sex with this person. And a lot of times the husband and the wife will say, we enjoy this. And my whole philosophy is, the wife is never going to be the actress on the video, right? And so I think it creates this false expectation, and then it's like a drug. You kind of need it to, to get that high or whatever that you're looking for. And so I'm so glad that you're bringing this up, because aside from the moral or the Christian obligations I feel like that we have according to the word, it just doesn't make good sense to introduce that into your relationship.
You're absolutely right. Let's just say for a second we take Christianity out completely. So we'll say, you know what, you are free to have sex however you want to, with whomever you want to, whenever you want to. Even if we were to believe that, pornography is still incredibly destructive for two big reasons. First of all, it does start that comparison game. Okay, so all of a sudden you're expecting I can have sex when I want to, and my partner is just going to be ready and willing and excited, just as excited as I am, with absolutely no thought and no focus on that person. So it's incredibly selfish, 100% selfish.
Wow. That's all I can say. If you grew up in the Black church, they used to say it's tight, but it's right. And that's exactly how I feel about the truth bombs that Jessica is dropping on us today. Listen, friends, I could talk to her for forever. Not just because she's a friend, but because she's so knowledgeable and so passionate about what she does. And it is my desire, as you watch these videos, as you listen, maybe you're listening to a podcast right now, I want you to be empowered to have strong, healthy, real relationships. So be sure to tune in to part 2. In part 2, we talk about things like what intimacy really is. We also talk about how to heal if you have experienced sexual brokenness in any way. Life is short, and life is supposed to be lived with passion and purpose and meaning. And if you are going through your relationships and you are struggling and you're having all kinds of drama and brokenness, that is not God's best for you. And so it is my desire, as I put this content out, that you walk in wholeness and that you walk in freedom in every single way. So thank you so much for watching. Be sure to watch part 2, and I will see you on the next video. Bye for now.